I thought I knew what a good father looked like. I thought I had done everything right. Worked 40 years, kept my promises, showed up for every birthday, every graduation, every moment my son needed me. And yet, on a Tuesday morning in February, I sat in a courtroom and listened to my own son's attorney describe me as a manipulative, vindictive man who had deliberately withheld what was rightfully owed to his family. I was 63 years old. I had never been sued in my life. I want to tell you how we got there. Not to make you angry on my behalf, though you might be. Not to paint myself as a perfect man, because I am not. But because I think there are fathers out there right now who are standing at the same crossroads I stood at, and I want them to know that saying no is not the same as stopping to love. My name is not important. What matters is that I spent the better part of 4 decades building a small but solid life in Central Ohio. I worked in commercial insurance, started as an adjuster right out of college, and eventually built my own agency with 2 partners. We were never flashy. We were never on magazine covers. But by the time I turned 60, my wife and I had a paid-off house, a lake cabin in Michigan we used every summer, and a retirement account that I had fed carefully and consistently for 35 years. My wife passed from cancer 6 years ago. That loss rearranged everything inside me. After she was gone, the money felt different, quieter, like it was just sitting there, waiting to matter again. My son was 34 when all of this began. He worked in tech sales, made good money, lived about 40 minutes away with his wife in a suburb outside Columbus. I liked my daughter-in-law well enough in the beginning. She was sharp, driven, the kind of woman who always seemed to be calculating something just behind her eyes. My wife had been warmer toward her than I was, but I kept my reservations to myself. My son loved her. That was enough for me. They had been married 4 years when the first real ask came. Not a request, exactly. More like a presentation. My son called one evening and said he wanted to come over and talk. He had something exciting to share. I made coffee, set out the good cups, the ones my wife had picked out at a shop in Savannah during a trip we took for our 25th anniversary, and I waited. He came alone. No daughter-in-law. That struck me as unusual, but I didn't say anything. He sat at my kitchen table and told me he and his wife had found a property, 5 acres, a house that needed work, in a township about 20 miles west of where they lived now. The asking price was $800,000. Their pre-approval was for $600,000. They were short $200,000, and they were wondering whether I would consider contributing the difference. I asked him to walk me through the numbers. He did. Their combined income was around $190,000 a year. Their current mortgage was $1,800 a month. The new property would run them, with taxes and insurance, somewhere around $5,000 a month on a 30-year note. And that was before any renovation costs. I asked him who had identified this property. He paused just slightly before answering. His wife had found it. She had grown up on property. She wanted land. She wanted space for horses eventually. It was her dream, he told me. I told him I needed a few days to think. He smiled and said, "Of course. No pressure." He left the cups on the table without offering to rinse them. That's a small thing. I know that's a small thing, but my wife always rinsed the cups, and she had taught him to do the same since he was 8 years old. I thought about it for 3 days. I ran the numbers myself, on paper, the old-fashioned way. At their income level, a $5,000 monthly housing cost represented over 30% of their gross and close to 40% of their net. That was beyond any threshold that a responsible lender would call comfortable. And the $200,000 they were asking for was not a small portion of what I had. It was meaningful. It was retirement meaningful. I called my son and told him I couldn't do it. I explained my reasoning calmly. I told him I loved him and I wanted him to have a wonderful life. But I didn't think this particular house, at this particular price, was the right move for their financial situation. I suggested they look at something in the $500,000 to $600,000 range and build from there. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he understood. He said he'd talk to his wife. I thought that was the end of it. 3 weeks later, my daughter-in-law called me directly. That was the first time she had ever called me without my son on the line. Her voice was professional, almost formal, like she was opening a negotiation. She told me she had done some research. She said she was aware, from conversations my son had shared with her over the years, that I had significant retirement savings. She used a specific number, a number my son had apparently mentioned to her years earlier, offhandedly, that I had accumulated. It was close to accurate. That bothered me more than anything else about the conversation. She said she felt it was important that family support family. She said the $200,000 would not diminish my lifestyle in any meaningful way. She said she and my son planned to eventually sell the property at a significant profit and that I would be paid back. I told her, as politely as I could manage, that the answer was still no. She thanked me for my time and hung up. I went out to the back porch and sat for a long while. The yard needed mowing. My wife would have had it looking better. I made a note to call the lawn service. 4 months passed. My son and I kept a surface-level peace. We had dinner once a month, talked on the phone occasionally, but something had shifted. He was cordial in the way people are when they're holding something they've decided not to say yet. In September, they bought the property anyway. I don't know how they financed it. I didn't ask. My son called to tell me, and there was something in his voice that was almost defiant, like he was waiting for me to react badly so he could use it. I told him congratulations. I meant it, genuinely. I hoped they would be happy there. The renovation started almost immediately. That's when the financial pressure, which they had apparently been suppressing, began to surface in ways that found their way back to me. My son started calling more. The calls were friendly at first, catching up calls, how are you calls, but they always ended up somewhere in the same neighborhood. The renovation was over budget. A contractor had done shoddy work, and they were dealing with a dispute. The septic system needed a full replacement. The horse barn required structural repairs before it could be used. Each call carried a weight beneath it, an unspoken question I could hear even when he wasn't asking it. I listened. I sympathized. I did not offer money. In January, 8 months after they had moved in, my son came to my house again. This time my daughter-in-law came with him. She did most of the talking. She laid it out plainly. They were in trouble. The renovation had cost $140,000 over what they projected. Their monthly carrying costs were higher than anticipated because of property tax reassessment. They had depleted their savings. They needed help, and they were asking me, formally and directly, for $250,000. Not as a loan, as a gift. She used the word gift specifically. She also said something that I have thought about almost every day since. She said that my wife, my son's mother, would have wanted him taken care of, that she would not have allowed her son to struggle while money sat unused. I felt something go very still inside me when she said that. I told them both that I needed them to leave my house, not angrily, quietly. I stood up, walked to the front door, and held it open. My son looked at me like he wasn't sure what was happening. My daughter-in-law gathered her coat with the careful movements of someone who had expected this and prepared for the next step. My son stopped at the door and said, "Dad, this isn't over." I closed the door and stood in my entryway for a long time. 6 weeks later, I was served. The lawsuit named me as a defendant in a civil claim. My son, through an attorney, was alleging that I had made verbal promises over the course of several years to contribute financially to his life, that those promises constituted an enforceable oral contract, and that my refusal to honor them had caused documented financial harm. The amount they were seeking was $475,000. I sat at my kitchen table and read the document 3 times. I called my attorney. She had handled my estate planning and the business transition when I sold my share of the agency 2 years earlier. She was sharp and unrattled, and she said to me, almost before I finished explaining, "Tell me everything, every conversation, every dollar you gave them, every promise you made, real or implied. Start from the beginning." So I did. Here is the part that most people don't understand about a situation like this. The instinct, when your own child sues you, is to feel like you failed, like something you did too much generosity, not enough boundaries. Some word spoken at the wrong moment created the monster that is now sitting across a legal table from you. I spent several nights in that particular spiral before my attorney said something that recalibrated me. She said, "You didn't cause this, but I need you to understand that the person driving this is not your son." She had done some background work by that point. My daughter-in-law had been in a financial dispute with her own parents several years before she married my son, a dispute over an inheritance that her parents had restructured after a falling out. She had some experience with this. She knew the language, and she knew the pressure points. My attorney also told me that the dollar figure they were seeking was not arbitrary. It was constructed to be just high enough to represent genuine threat to my retirement security, which meant it was designed to make me want to settle. I decided I was not going to settle. The discovery process was uncomfortable. There were depositions, document requests, interrogatories. My son had to sit across from my attorney and answer questions. I was not in the room for that. But she told me afterward that he had looked tired, that he had answered carefully, like someone who was trying to protect a story someone else had told him. My daughter-in-law's deposition was different. My attorney described her as composed, well-prepared, and precise. She had a clear narrative, and she held to it. There were two moments in the pretrial period that I will not forget. The first was when the financial records surfaced showing that my daughter-in-law's parents, who were, by all accounts, substantially wealthier than I was, owning commercial real estate across 3 states, had contributed exactly nothing to the purchase of the property or the renovation. Not $1. Her parents, who had money that dwarfed mine, had watched their daughter and son-in-law spiral into financial distress and had not moved. When my attorney introduced this in pretrial motions, as part of establishing context, the opposing attorney objected on grounds of relevance. The judge allowed it. The second moment came from my own records. Because I am careful, and because my wife raised me to be careful, I had kept notes. Nothing formal. Just a habit. I have a small notebook I jot things in, dates and amounts and brief summaries of important conversations. I had entries going back years. My son's wedding, what I contributed and when. A loan I had made them in their 2nd year of marriage, which they had paid back. The calls, the visits, what was discussed. My notes did not record any promise. Not a single entry said anything resembling a commitment to fund their future. My attorney called them the most useful $8 I've ever seen spent on a spiral notebook. The trial was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in February. 2 days before, my son called me. I almost didn't answer. I am glad I did. He sounded different, quieter than he had been in over a year. He said he wanted me to know that he was sorry for how things had gotten. He said he hadn't wanted it to go this far. He said some things had happened that he couldn't talk about yet, but that he needed me to know he loved me. I told him I loved him too. There was a long pause, and then he said he had to go. I didn't sleep well that night. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I had been in courtrooms before, for business matters, but something about being there in a personal matter made the room feel different, closer. The judge was a woman in her late 50s, measured in her manner, the kind of person who seems to be listening to 3 things simultaneously. The opposing attorney made their opening. He outlined the alleged oral promises, the history of financial support, the reasonable expectation of continued contribution. He was smooth and practiced. He used the word family several times in ways that were clearly calculated. My attorney was shorter and more precise. She introduced the notebook. She introduced the absence of any written agreement. She introduced the history of what I had actually given freely, without obligation, versus what was now being characterized as a promise. She introduced the financial records of my daughter-in-law's family, and noted that the couple had access to another potential source of support that had never been approached. My son testified in the morning. He held to the narrative, but there were moments where the seams showed. When my attorney asked him to recall the specific words I had allegedly used to promise future financial support, he paused for longer than was comfortable. He said things like, "The implication was clear, and it was understood between us." My attorney did not press hard. She just let the pauses sit. I testified after lunch. I told the truth. All of it. What I had given, what I had said, what I had not said. I talked about my wife and her passing, and what that had changed about how I thought about money and legacy. I talked about wanting my son to be strong, not comfortable. I talked about the night I asked them both to leave my house and why. And then the judge asked me something. She looked at me directly and she said, "In the past 12 months, how many times did your son call you to ask how you were doing, not about money, not about the property, not about the lawsuit, just to check on you?" I thought about it honestly. I wanted to be fair to my son. I wanted to find the calls. I said, "Once, maybe twice. There was a call in the spring when I had a health scare, nothing serious, but I mentioned it." He called to follow up on that. The judge wrote something down and said nothing else. Closing arguments were brief. By 3 in the afternoon, the judge had what she needed. She ruled the following morning. She found no evidence of an enforceable oral contract. She found no credible testimony establishing a specific promise of financial contribution. She noted that the financial history between us showed a pattern of voluntary gifts and a single repaid loan, none of which created legal obligation for future support. She dismissed the claim in its entirety. She also did something that judges are not required to do. She made a comment on the record. She said that she had presided over many family disputes in her years on the bench, and that the ones which caused her the most concern were not the ones driven by greed alone, but the ones in which one family member had been positioned as a financial resource rather than a person. She said she hoped the parties would take time to consider what they actually wanted from one another, and whether what they had sought in her courtroom was truly it. She looked at my son when she said it. He was staring at the table. My attorney and I walked out into a gray February afternoon. She shook my hand and said I had held up well. I thanked her and meant it. Then I drove home alone and sat in my kitchen and felt something that was not exactly relief. It was more like exhaustion, wearing relief's coat. I did not hear from my son for 2 months. When he called, in April, he asked if he could come over. He came alone. He looked like he had not been sleeping well. His face had the particular tightness of someone carrying something heavy, and mostly privately. He sat at my kitchen table, the same chairs, and he told me that he and his wife were separated. He said it had not happened because of the lawsuit. He said it had been coming for a long time. He said there were things about his marriage that he had not wanted to see, and that the events of the past year had made them impossible to ignore. He said his wife had, after the ruling, contacted her own parents about financial help. Her parents had refused her the same way I had refused them. He said watching that happen had been clarifying for him in a way he couldn't fully articulate. He said he was sorry. Not a rushed, defensive sorry. A slow one. He said he was sorry for the lawsuit. He was sorry for the calls that were really pressure campaigns. He was sorry for what his wife had said about his mother. He said he had not known she was going to say that and that it had bothered him ever since. I told him I forgave him. We sat together for a long while without talking very much. I made coffee. He rinsed the cups when we were done. He sold the property 8 months later, at a modest loss. He moved into an apartment closer to the city. We started having dinner again. Real dinners. The kind where we talked about things that had nothing to do with money. A fishing trip we had taken when he was 12. A book I was reading. A project he was excited about at work. He started calling just to call. Checking in. Asking how I was doing. In the way that means the person actually wants to know. I am 64 now. I have more than I need and I am careful with it. Not because I am afraid of my son, but because my wife worked alongside me to build it. And that means it carries her in it. I will leave something for my son when I am gone. That has never changed. But I will leave it on my timeline, in the way that honors what it cost to build it. Not because a courtroom or a demand or a phone call made me feel like I had no other choice. There are people in my life who asked me, during all of this, whether I was afraid of losing my son, whether it would have been easier to write the check and keep the peace. I always gave the same answer. Peace that is bought is not peace. It is a lease on quiet that someone else controls the terms of. The moment you sign that lease, you have taught everyone around you the price of your compliance, and they will return to collect it again and again until there is nothing left. My son and I are closer now than we were for most of his 30s. Not because I won in court, not because his wife left, but because I held a line that was true. And on the other side of it, he found his way back to who he actually was. I still use the lake cabin in Michigan every summer. Last July, My son came up for a week. We took the boat out early every morning while the water was still flat. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Some things you cannot buy. The quiet on a lake at 6 in the morning, next to your son, both of you, watching the mist come off the water that is not available for $250,000 or $475,000 or any number anyone could put on a legal document. It is only available to people who were willing to lose it in order to keep it real. I would do it again. Every hard conversation, every served paper, every sleepless night, I would do all of it again. Because the man who came to that lake last summer, the one who rinsed his cup before he left and hugged me at the door like he meant it, that man is worth every single bit of what it cost to wait for him.